Thank you so much. And I'm glad I made it here on time, despite the shifts. And apologize for any, if I appear distracted. It's a bit of a day in British politics today, so there's a lot to keep track of. But nevertheless, really happy to be here. And I'm really excited to be presenting this paper on behalf of the really interdisciplinary collaborative team that we had working on it. Including collaborators from the Nepal Red Cross, as well as researchers in my team at Nesta, at the Center for Collective Intelligence Design in our data analytics practice. And what I'm going to spend talking the next 15 minutes talking about is how we have tried a new type of approach to developing a machine learning tool in the humanitarian sector using an approach we call participatory AI. So I'll start by describing a little what I mean by that, and then I'll talk about some of the things that we found. So I guess participatory AI or participatory machine learning might be a new term to some of you. And it's certainly an emerging field of practice. I guess in its broadest sense, it's referring to the wide range of participatory methods that you might introduce at different stages of the AI development lifecycle, all the way from data collection to the oversight of a tool that's already been deployed in a real world context. And within those participatory activities, it's motivated by involving a wider group of stakeholders than just the technology team that is normally responsible for the design and development and deployment of tools. And I think one of the first attempts really to bring this community of practitioners together was a workshop hosted as part of the ICML conference in 2020, where organizers were almost a little bit in contrast to some of the discussions happening in the AI and fairness community and the human-centered design and machine learning community, really wanting to explore participation as a method to really shift power balance in the deployment of new technologies, and also to explore issues of trust and appropriateness of tools developed for high stakes decision making. And I think that this kind of highlights that at the moment there is a lot of emerging practice in this field, including practitioners who are really centered or coming from the schools of thought more focused on human-centered design of machine learning systems. And so often when you read about case studies or emerging practice, there are different justifications or intentions that are given for introducing a participatory process. But I think the thing that unites them all is that they in some way try to address the critiques, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of how the risks that AI systems pose, particularly when it comes to high stakes decision domains, such as the humanitarian sector, which is where our case study was really focusing the work. And so to give a little bit of context, as with many other domains, we've really seen an uptick of interest in applying machine learning tools in the humanitarian sector. And this is partly to do with a shift in focus in the humanitarian field towards more anticipatory action. And so there's been a lot of attention on predictive models that can help to understand in advance of the crisis occurring where and when it will happen, as well as who the most vulnerable people are. And this has happened hand in hand also with the increased availability of different data sources, in part mobilized through the humanitarian data exchange, which you can see on this slide, and more kind of traditional data sources, as well as emerging data sets such as satellite data, social media data, and also call data records. And so we see that a lot of these novel data sources are contributing increasingly to the development of predictive models in the humanitarian field. And a recent review by the Overseas Development Institute actually showed that crowdsourcing is increasingly being used as a data input into these models, but highlighted that this doesn't mean that people whose data is being crowdsourced either passively or actively are involved in the design or development of the tools. So we're still missing that kind of input from frontline voices when those tools are being developed. And that's a real problem for the humanitarian sector because of the commitment across the sector to localization as part of the grand bargain. And you might also have heard of something called the Core Humanitarian Standard, which is a set of 9 principles, which is meant to govern the activities of humanitarian organizations in relation to the support that they deliver to crisis-affected communities. And so I appreciate this is a very ugly slide. I'm sorry about that. It's more to demonstrate that at the start of this project, we carried out an analysis which compared the core humanitarian standards, so those commitments made by the humanitarian sector, against some of the criticisms that are posed or leveraged against AI models, and also mapped that onto potential participatory methods that could be introduced in the development and design process that could help to either mitigate some of the concerns or hopefully decrease some of the risks. And so this was the basis for how we first developed a new framework to guide our activities in our work with the Nepal Red Cross. And you can see a kind of adapted version to the first one that we published of that framework for participatory AI on the right of this slide. And on the left-hand side is a simplified kind of version of the pipeline of a model development from data collection all the way through to deployment. And then on the right-hand side, we've also got the different parts of tool design that you might need to consider and how to involve wider stakeholder communities in that part of developing an overall tool as well. And so in this adapted version, we've particularly highlighted the steps that we followed, all of the different intervention points that we tested throughout our piloting and prototyping phases with the Nepal Red Cross. And so really we were trying to understand whether by working in this way, we could deliver on some of the claims or the promises of this emerging community of practice around participatory AI and improve the perceived efficacy of the tools as well as their actual performance accuracy. And also to understand if there was any effect on the trustworthiness of those tools, both by the intended users, but also by some of the communities that might be impacted by their use. But of course, we needed to start with a problem that we were trying to address. And so this was a period at the start of the project where we collaboratively framed a problem together with the Red Cross. We're really keen to work on an issue that they're currently reviewing as an organization, which is concerned with the distribution of non-food relief items after natural disasters. And so this is something that hasn't been reviewed by the organization for the last 10 years. And through interviews with crisis-affected communities, they discovered that actually a key problem was that the items that they were delivering after crises weren't matching the needs that people had. And so just to also give a little bit of background, the kind of items that might be included in these packages include clothing, hygiene items, also shelter items and blankets, etc. And so this was the kind of initial stages that informed the concept that we designed together with them. And the tool that we proposed is what we call NFRI Predict. And it uses 2 classification models to predict the likelihood of essentialness of different items that are included in NFRI packages based on an input of different household characteristics. And so this tool is intended to help members of the disaster management team in the Nepal Red Cross to who have access to data about different household characteristics at the district level to enter information such as demographic information or location data in order to then be able to understand what are the different items that are needed by those populations. And so to train this model, we used a new data set that was collected with the help of Red Cross volunteers who went into two geographically distinct regions of Nepal called Sindhipalchik and Makatari to collect data about community preferences from more than 3,000 households. And I wanted to give a little bit of context what the kind of geography is and where we were working. So I've mentioned Sindhipalchik and Makatari, where we did data collection. This was also where we conducted design workshops that affected the algorithm development and tuning phase. And we also carried out participatory evaluation activities, in part in another district location, the Mustang region, as well as the central location with the Central Red Cross staff in Kathmandu. So I'll talk a little bit about now what we did during those design workshops. We were really concerned with trying to understand what the preferences were for local communities who were impacted by most often flooding crises, and understanding what they thought were the most important inputs, the features that would be most predictive of the needs of families after crises. And so we had two different approaches that we used in the workshop for prioritization exercises, and I'll only highlight the key results here. But an additional second activity we also carried out was to understand in a broader context, the kind of values that they thought were most important in dictating decision-making about NFRI distribution. So not only thinking about the model, but the wider decision-making process. And so when it came to feature selection, a key result that we found was that 2/3 of participants were selecting ethnicity as the least important feature that should be going into the model. And this was actually in contrast to the automated feature selection that we undertook, which had ethnicity as one of the features that should be included in the model. And it prompted us to do a comparison of the accuracy with ethnicity included and without. And we actually found that it didn't have a sizable or a significant effect on the accuracy of the model. Both were approximately 80% with an F1 score of 0.85. And so this was a really useful prompt for us to actually adapt and tune the model to the preferences of local stakeholders, and also an early stage indicator that we had over-selected features. And during the values elicitation exercise, we found that the really key priorities that local stakeholders highlighted that they thought would assess kind of the appropriateness of the tool in this context would be how well it performed on accuracy, speed, and being able to address the needs of the most vulnerable. And so those three criteria were 3 of 5 that we used during a comparative evaluation in our participatory evaluation workshops. We started those with activities that really went into depth explaining how the model worked and scenarios that tested the understanding of our stakeholders about the limitations of the model. And then we asked them to compare the perceived effectiveness or the perceived benefit of applying the NFRI Predict tool in comparison to the process that is currently followed by the Red Cross. And we found that 6 out of 8 evaluation groups actually thought that there would be an improvement in terms of accuracy and being able to address the needs of the most vulnerable. And they also highlighted a particular point in crisis management process where this tool would be most appropriate, namely the preparedness phase, where they thought that the value would come from being able to pre-position and stockpile the NFRI items in advance of crises. We also tracked participants' attitudes towards the tool across all of the workshops. And this helped us to understand a little bit about the kind of valence of their feelings towards the tool in terms of positive or negative, and also the kind of levels of trust that they had towards it, in addition to the comparative evaluation results. And there were some interesting findings here. So even though in general, across both district and central locations, we found quite a high level of positive feeling towards the tool, there were some caveats. So for example, the central team, the Central Disaster Management team in Kathmandu, they were in general quite positive about the tool, but the rating of positivity fell to 36% when faced with the prospect of that being the only input into decision making, rather than having that as just one of the inputs into decision making. And similarly, even though our district level participants in the evaluation phase were generally positive about the tool, they did say that they would only consider using it if it was retrained using local data rather than data from the other two districts. And I think unsurprisingly, probably a lot of our participants were advocates or were really kind of for this type of approach to developing new technology. And through our qualitative analysis of discussions, we think there's some indication that that could be a contributing factor to them trusting the tool. And this is something that they also stated, that it helps them to actually trust the tool, knowing that others like them had contributed to it. So appreciate this has been a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I think to summarize just some of the key takeaways, we, I think, have started to show that there is I guess, validity to some of these arguments that taking an approach like this has a real impact on trust, but a lot more work would need to be done to really disentangle the kind of causal factors here. And in particular, I think it would be interesting to look at how the level of understanding of how the tool works actually maps onto the perceived effectiveness or appropriateness and trustworthiness of it. But we also found that apart from being able to kind of impact and influence the tool development and its performance accuracy, that these types of activities were really useful for surfacing the kind of wider socio-technical factors and challenges to introducing these types of tools into high stakes decision making. So they almost, the model and the tool almost functioned as a kind of design probe into the, to allow some of the conversations to take place between these different stakeholder groups. And I guess the main takeaway really is that we hope that this is a demonstration that it is possible to develop AI in AI-based tools in a very different way, and that others can also start doing it, so that we can interrogate some of the claims that are made by these competing schools of participatory AI practitioners, and really start building the evidence base of when it is appropriate to introduce participatory methods and how it's best to work with them throughout the design and development process. And of course, I can't finish without thanking the incredible multidisciplinary international team that was a core part of making this project happen. So from our colleagues in the Red Cross, the IFRC, and also we were supported by researchers at Newcastle University's Open Lab, as well as multiple colleagues at Nesta. So yeah, it was really a multidisciplinary, multi-domain effort. And anyone who would like to know more details can find a report on this online on the Nesta website, as well as a technical methodology report that we've published and a GitHub repository documenting the code and the kind of approach we took in developing the model. I'm going to take a breath now. Thank you so much for letting me talk for so long.
Wonderful. Thank you so